Greetings, listeners. This is Crissy Groenwegen back with another episode of the Fortitude podcast. As many of you know, I have been interviewing the parents who attended our Hill Day. But April marks the 4-year anniversary of the start of PAN. And so I thought it was a perfect time to do a special edition episode with our renowned CEO, Dr. Kevin Sabet. So, Kevin, thank you so much for making the time. I know how busy you are.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor.
We talk so much with our parents that the parent stories are what matter. And while science and stats and data is all very important, of course, it's these stories that really drive this message home. And when I speak about you, when we're introducing new people into the network, I always tell them my favorite line that for me, you are the Nostradamus of this. You literally predicted what was going to happen in this industry. So I'd really like to talk about how and why you decided to start PAN.
hmm Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me again. I appreciate it. A big fan of the podcast and, of course, all the work you're
Thank you.
doing. And we're honored to have you and Bronwyn and everybody on the team working towards this. Jamie does a lot of work with us, and the various parents that are around. So many of them doing very incredible work. Um, you know, I've been in doing this field. I've been in this field for a long time. I started as a teenager, and you know we've been arguing the facts for 30 years, and they're very
Mhm.
important. It's important to talk to people about the risks and what the science says, because we have to be informed by evidence. But just became clear to me that, it's amazing how much progress the legalization side has made with no science, which is interesting. And how have they done that? Well, they've been very effective at using, sort of stories and individuals, because those really tug at the heart. And I thought, well, frankly, we should be doing that too. I mean, there are now so many stories as a result of these bad policies and so many lives that have been affected, that we can reach people's hearts that way, maybe even better than peer reviewed studies. And whether that's good or not is another point
Yeah.
entirely, whether it should be the case, but I think it just is the case. And so it was really important. And also, just it's not just about convincing other people, it's really about giving more purpose to our work, and seeing the human toll, reminding us why we're doing what we're doing, because this can be a very lonely business. It can be a
Yeah.
rough business. It can be a business where your family is attacked, you're attacked physically, psychologically, every way you can think of. And so it's important, how do we keep going? And one way is to remember the Andys of the world and the Randys of the world. And it's just really important to do that. So it was really obvious to me we needed to start organizing parents again. The last thing I'll also say about this, and the reason why, is because, having grown up in this field for the last 30 years, I grew up with a lot of the pioneers of the original parent movement that kind of,
Yes.
in some ways, took me under their wings. People like Sue Rushi, Joyce Lepka, Otto Moulton. These are people who, seeing the negative consequences of permissive drug policy in the 70s from all political backgrounds, organized very effectively and changed minds, from Bob DuPont, who they changed his mind, to legislators all over the
Hmm.
country. And so, just really important to understand that there is such thing as something as parent power, and that it's very important.
Hmm. I remember you telling me when I first began that there was one particular story, and she has been a guest on our podcast, Sally Schindel. Can you tell our
Mhm.
audience a little bit about that story and how Sally came to you and what you do in honor of Sally and
Yeah,
Andy?
well, yeah. I mean, I met Sally. Gosh, it was before the ballot initiative in Arizona, when she approached us, and she, showed me that note that Andy left, and I'll never forget it. And that's just always been seared into my mind, when he said that the marijuana killed his soul. And that's four simple words having such an impact on somebody. I was greatly impacted by that, because we are in the business again of souls and lives and hearts. It's just that we have to always remember that. That's why we're doing this. And her coming to me with that and saying that, some of the stuff she's read of mine had given her purpose and hope, always just has always stuck with me.
Yeah, she was very open on her episode, and she actually shared the full letter with us,
Yeah.
and it was very profound. But she always talks about
Yes.
how you told her that you carry that letter to this day
Yes.
wherever you go. And I know
I
that it's
do.
a fact because I have seen it and you have showed it to
Yes.
us. And I remember seeing
Yes.
you back in 2019 when I was a prevention specialist in New York
Hmm.
and I came to a
Hmm.
presentation, and you actually mentioned that and took that letter out of your pocket while doing your presentation. And again, that was pretty far
Yes.
back, so these stories are just
Yeah.
building more and more and more. And even back then,
Yeah.
we didn't know it was going to become this bad with the mental health issues
Yeah.
with our youth.
Yes.
So
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
uh, brings me to the fact that we know that the culture is catching up with the science on marijuana. And even the New York
Yes.
Times editorial board came out and said legalization has been a complete failure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, their conclusion is still off compared to ours, arguing that legalization just needs to be better regulated. So, this
Yeah.
article was a great victory for you. Can you talk a little bit about why that is and share more about your history with the New York Times?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we're going to go into depth on this where I interviewed the writer of that editorial on
Wow.
our new podcast, which
Ah,
we're launching it for Sam called High Stakes. And that'll be coming out very soon, but listeners can look for High Stakes. It's already on the Apple and Spotify platforms, so they'll know the
great.
minute that episode gets dropped. It's just being edited now. But it is really important for me. I mean, look, I have been reading the New York Times for a long time, obviously, seminal newspaper in this country. And, I'll never forget in 2016 when they came out, or no, sorry, 2014, I believe, when they came out with a 6-part series called, Repeal Prohibition Again. And it was really a gut punch because, the New York Times history, interestingly, had not been pro legalization
Hmm.
beforehand. There was a very famous executive editor of the Times named A.M. Rosenthal. And A.M. Rosenthal dedicated many columns to the dangers of drugs, talked about it a lot. And your listeners can look into those archives. Very good pieces. But then, things changed. And in 2014, they came out with this thing. And it was essentially written by the editorial board and informed by some very pro drug professors who we now know admittedly use drugs like heroin on a regular
Right.
basis and think there's no problem with it. And it was really a gut punch. It was awful. And I immediately wanted to talk to the editorial board. And we tried to reach them and they ignored us. And then finally in 2019, when things were coming to a head in the state of New York, I think they felt forced to have to take a meeting with us. And so I went there really alone. And well, we had our one of our comms people with us, but it was me and him. But they were asking all the questions for me. And it was about 30 people in that room. It was a lot of people. It was way more than the editorial board, I believe. It was
Wow.
staff writers and other writers and editors. They wanted, they wanted to, I guess they all wanted to throw tomatoes at me or something, but basically they were there. And, I went in that building and, essentially they looked at what I said with askance. They were very disapproving in many ways with what I was saying, everything I was saying about the harms and about how we didn't want this in New York and etc. And they just they didn't. I don't think any of that registered with them. And then finally, I had realized that editorial board had also changed a little bit, and actually somebody who had done a profile for me with Vox, which was Ezra Klein's piece, who's also a writer for the Times, named Herman Lopez, was on the editorial board. And I thought, well, maybe there's a chance something will change because he's more thoughtful. We don't agree on everything, but he's definitely more thoughtful than some of the folks I encountered into that meeting I had. But I never thought in my wildest dreams I would see a headline that said, America has a marijuana problem.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it because they were downplaying that so much. And so just seeing that, you know, recently was just it's hard to describe how important it was to me because of the history I had with them. And they did stick with their conclusion. We just need to regulate it more. But I really think they stuck to that conclusion because they're so institutionally tied to legalization. Like that would be too far right now. I have hope that in the future that's going to change, but it was just going to be too far right now. But what they did, it didn't. And there were some people that said, Kevin, why are you liking this? They still want legalization. In fact, it's worse because they're kind of saying there's a way to do it safely when we know there isn't, and that can lure in a lot of well-meaning people. And I understand that point, but I saw in that editorial the bigger picture. It was less important what the policy was, because that's policy. It was more important
Right.
what they were saying about the harms. And sure enough, the response on social media, on X, whether it was from the left or even the right that sort of doesn't
Mhm.
like the New York Times, they still use it as a standard. The fact that this thing was talked about for weeks, and it changed many people's minds. I know that because, wow, if the New York Times is admitting they were wrong, maybe I should too. It gave people permission to admit they were wrong on this issue. And
Right.
I think that's just so important.
Wow. Yeah, it really was something. And again, we're hearing more and more. There are so many more articles and editorials and stories, even from people other than parents coming to Pam. We're hearing more and more stories. And then, of course, we look for those parents because we'd love to have them here with us, advocating on the Hill.
Yes.
But it's
Yes.
really something. And it's so upsetting. Bronwyn and I say all the time that we love our job and we love doing this work and we honor these parents, but it's really very sad to say that we have a full-time
Yes.
job doing what we do
Yes.
because we spend almost half of every week welcoming more people into the network. And so that's hearing
Mhm.
more stories every single
Yeah,
week of every single month of every
definitely.
single year that we're here. And that's not an
Definitely.
exaggeration. So it's really
Definitely.
hard. And I will tell
It
you that
is.
there are many parents that come to us, however they find us. Some have never even heard of smart approaches to marijuana, which is very interesting. And that's when we
Which
have
is,
the opportunity to talk about smart approaches to marijuana and you, of
yeah.
course, and how we got here. And so that's where I use my famous line about you being the Nostradamus of this, because really you've been saying this for well over 10 years now, and you were right. And to us, that's very important that you were right about this, and we have to keep fighting. And
Yeah.
so marijuana is so much a part of what we do at Sam and Pan, and many listeners know that you've written Reefer Sanity and Smokescreen, but your latest book, One Nation Under the Influence, is about
Mm-hmm.
much more than just marijuana. It's about the drug crisis
Mm-hmm.
in our country and the history of drug
Mm-hmm.
prevention and what we can do.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about why you wrote this book and why now?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, there are a couple reasons. I think one is I think the fentanyl crisis has reawakened the country to drugs in a way that really hasn't happened probably since the crack epidemic. And when that happens, it's good because there's more awareness out there about it. That's the good side of it. Obviously, it's horrible what's happening in terms of the numbers with overdoses, but I also think that it has made many people um, become experts overnight, so-called experts, and think that they have the solutions. And some of those solutions can be good. There are great prevention groups that never would have been here if it wasn't for what happened to their child. So, for example, Song for Charlie and the work that they're doing is amazing. But then on the other side of the equation, it's also allowed for very dangerous policies to come into play because it says, "Hey, we're having an emergency crisis. We got to stop this at any point, any means necessary." And by any means necessary means very radical, extreme things. So, for
Mhm.
example, in Canada, a program they're trying to expand to the US, which is they call it Safe Supply, which is really just a drug substitution
Yeah,
program where you give prescribed opioids. And of course, we know how that story ended
yeah.
before in this country, but prescribed opioids to people with a heroin or fentanyl, I should say, opioid addiction,
Mhm.
so that they use that as opposed to the fentanyl, which is going to kill them. And at least the opioids will be a slower death, I guess, is the logic,
Yeah,
because it won't be adulterated, so to speak. So they can just be addicted their whole life and hopefully not die, although many of them will, because we look at the
yeah.
overdose epidemic in this country about pills. And of course, what's really happening is that those users still want fentanyl. They're just now selling these pills to naive users, the people that aren't going to start on fentanyl, who would say, on Monday, they'll never use fentanyl, and on Saturday, they're using it.
Mhm.
But those naive users, and then using that money to buy the fentanyl, which their brain wants. And just these very, very problematic issues and problematic policies. And, you know, it was clear to me this is way more than marijuana. This is about the same, a lot of the same lobby that wants to legalize marijuana now moving to psychedelics and to opioids and
Right.
stimulants, et cetera. And so I was very concerned about that. The other thing that I saw was there are some really great programs out there and strategies being implemented that are really making a difference. So you can look at, you know, I talk about Iceland with prevention, and it's kind of a weird place to think about prevention, but they have one of the most successful prevention, you know, strategies in the world. You look at a place like you know, Hawaii, what they did with people on probation and parole in the criminal justice system. Also, sort of strange to think about Hawaii, but you know, there are these pockets of promise around the country, and I thought to myself, imagine if we brought those all to scale in a way that we've never done before. So it really is a call for countries to do that.
Hmm.
And, you know, it also looks at the psychedelic issue. It looks like what's happening in Portugal and all the misperceptions in Portugal. It looks what's happening in, you know, like I said, in Canada, it looks at. So it really was a wide ranging look. And I just felt that it needed to happen because there was so much misinformation there that has come with the fentanyl crisis.
Right, right. And, it's interesting for us too, because our parents we're very in tune to them. And so they get nervous. They say, well, is everything okay at smart approaches to marijuana? Like Kevin's not going to move away from the marijuana issue. And so we have
No.
to reassure them of that. And
Oh, yeah. No,
yeah, and that's
no.
it's an interesting concern. And then also you
Yeah.
mentioned other uh drugs like the psychedelics, because I mean we've said in prevention forever that we're never going to eradicate drug use. We're never going to
Yeah.
eradicate drugs in this nation,
Yeah.
and there's always going to be something. So I think your book in some ways actually prepares us for that and lets us know
Yeah.
that we're always going to keep fighting as well. And from the
Definitely.
pan perspective, I just want to let our listeners know that while we are focused on marijuana issues and most of our stories are stories where marijuana is the drug of choice that became the problem, we also do have PAN FDPS, which is the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions, where we are interviewing and taking in those stories from parents who have had issues with other drugs, not just fentanyl, but like kratom, mushrooms,
Yeah.
and all the harms that come along with those substances. So that's much smaller. And yes, our
Yeah.
focus is marijuana, but we are building there as well because we're
Yeah,
always going to want to
and we
advocate.
should because on the one hand, while we are focused on marijuana because it's a drug that is the most prolific, it's a drug that's seen the most increase. It's the only drug really where there's been a big increase. You know, eh, we also know that addiction isn't substance specific, and
Hmm.
so it's really important to look at the big picture. And yeah, I mean, look, you know, I felt like I wanted to write another book. I felt like this was the most compelling argument I could bring. I felt like I had said a lot about marijuana in my previous two books, Reefer Sanity and Smokescreen. Doesn't mean that I won't. I mean, I'm still
Hmm.
going to write about marijuana, and I'm, you know, I'm thinking about what that is. There's been a lot of new things. For example, this hemp issue, you know, is a twist that,
Right.
frankly, since Smokescreen has really come up. So there are a lot of issues still with marijuana to be told, but I just felt like there needed to be something that zoomed out a little bit, that looked at all the drugs, because you can apply everything I said to marijuana, everything I said in that book
Absolutely.
to marijuana. It's actually not a non marijuana book. In many ways, marijuana is still very prominent, but it's looking at it from a different perspective and bringing in the
Right.
other drugs as well.
Right. I know we mentioned it earlier. You happened to mention Surush and a parent movement. Can we talk about that a little bit more?
Sure.
How a parent movement is important and how that kind of drove some of your thoughts in creating PAN and how parents can influence prevention policies.
Sure. Well, it's a good history. So, I mean, in the mid 70s, basically in Atlanta, there was a woman named Keith Shuhart, and they were having a birthday party for their oldest daughter, who was turning 13. And they realized at the party, they basically they were in the backyard. The parents, I think, were inside. Then when they went outside, they saw the children were using, you know, marijuana basically, and like drugs like PCP. I mean, this was crazy. They were shocked. They called the parents of the kids, the next day. And the parents were also shocked. The parents did not know what was going on. They didn't know these drugs were available. They didn't really know anything about them. And so from that, they formed the first parent peer group. They founded a group called Pride, which is Parents Resource Institute for Drug Education at Georgia State. And that's also where, basically, about a year later, Sue Rushi noticed a lot of shops in her neighborhood were selling drug paraphernalia, which was basically the marketing arm of the drug culture. And she reached out to other parents. They formed the first parent community group called National Families in Action.
Mhm.
And they led the efforts to ban these paraphernalia shops. And the Supreme Court also agreed with them. And this was happening all over the country. I mean, you had Carla Lowe in California
Right.
that was looking at this. You had, again, Otto Moulton in Massachusetts. I mentioned him earlier. So there were a lot of these groups that were coming up, and the Pride group and the national group called National Federation of Parents with
Mhm.
Joyce Nalepka, as I mentioned, in Washington. They kind of all came together and really fought this for a long time in every community around the country. Unfortunately, they sort of disbanded, although National Families in Action stayed intact. But in many ways, they disbanded in the mid 90s, which was too bad. And that
Mhm.
was also something we wanted to make sure that, again, with PAN, in some ways, we were helping revive. And of course, other people are
Yeah.
contributing to this as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So for our listeners that do revere you as the premier leader on anti-marijuana
Mhm.
legislation, can you leave us with some reassurances of why advocacy work matters so much and why it continues to matter even when it seems like the odds are against us?
Yeah. Well, I think it matters more than ever at this moment. And I
I
mean
do
that
too.
because I feel like we really have the wind at our backs in so many ways. First of all, you have states that are considering repeal. This was not a conversation we could have 4 years ago. Like it was just a red line. I couldn't even say
Mhm.
that word. But we are now having states, whether it's Massachusetts, Maine, Oklahoma, other states, looking at this right now very seriously. I don't know if they're going to get it on the first try. Frankly, it took the legalization side 40 years to get it done. On
Right.
many tries, they failed. People forget that. But so this is a key moment right now in our field. You have the publications like the New York Times changing their tune, and a lot of other mainstream networks and news organizations changing their tune. People saying, "Wow, maybe there is." You had someone like Alex Berenson, which I think is also
Yeah.
very important, and with his book, and that has woken up a lot of people. And so I think that really there's so much wind at our sails right now. This is the time not to let up. This is the time to double down on our efforts. In some ways, I feel like I wish Smokescreen was also coming out right now, because this is really in some ways like a moment in this country where people are really thinking, you know what, maybe this thing isn't as cracked up as we thought it was, not as good as we thought it was. So I just think that now more than ever this matters.
Right. It's so funny because forget that I do this work here now, but like even just as a parent, I could not have fathomed, and even as a prevention specialist when we were toying with legalization in New York, I could not have fathomed how anyone could think this was a good idea. It's just so
Hmm.
sad to me that profits drive everything because I mean, how
Hmm.
could you not have expected this can of worms? And I remember one thing
Hmm.
when many a parent and many an adult will still say, "Oh, it's just marijuana. It's no big deal." And what I say to them that does get people to think sometimes. So one of my biggest fears is pilots, right? I don't want to be on a plane, whether there's autopilot or not, with a stoned pilot.
Yeah.
But I say to parents,
Right.
so you say it's no big deal. Let me ask you this. Is it a big deal to you that your child's bus driver gets up in the morning and has a cup
Right.
of coffee and smokes a joint and then gets in their bus to go pick up your kid because it's legal and harmless,
Right.
right? That's okay with you. And that
Right.
shuts people up really quick. They're like,
It
uh,
does.
you know, it's like,
And really, I mean, if you think about, some people say, well, this is like the same sex marriage issue. You just have to get on with the times. And it's the same kind of thing. My response is, no matter what my opinion is on same sex marriage, um, if my kid's bus driver is in a same sex marriage or not, that's not going to affect the way they drive my kid to school.
Right.
If my doctor is, it's not going to affect his work on me. If my pilot is, it's not going to. And so this is something that does affect other people in very, very dramatic ways. It's beyond a
Absolutely.
moral issue. I also think it's a moral issue, but it's beyond that.
Mhm.
And I think we need to recognize that.
Yeah. Yeah, I do too. So thank you so much for giving us your
Great.
time and telling us all of
Sure.
this. You mentioned your new podcast coming out. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm very excited. It's called High Stakes,
I love
and I'm
that name.
recording it yeah, in a professional studio, and we're going to have really great guests every time, and it's really going to be quality more than quantity, I think. And it's a deep dive into these issues. I'm going to be sharing, me. I love the history side of it, so there'll always be tidbits of sprinkled through it, as well as kind of what the latest issues are that we're talking about as a country. So I'm excited about it.
Wow, sounds great. We can't wait to tout that and get that out there. So,
Thanks.
Kevin,
Thank
thanks
you.
again so much for being here. Thank you for doing all you
Thanks.
do. I mean,
Appreciate it.
you really are something else, and I'm
Thank
proud
you.
to work here. So, thanks
Well,
so
you are
much.
too. Listen, you are too, and I'm proud to be on your team. I'm proud, so proud of the Pan parents. Honestly, nothing warms my heart than seeing a group of our Pan parents in Washington, D.C., whether it's on the Hill or at our offices, talking with them. Like nothing
Mhm.
does. It's way better than going to some scientific meeting or some meeting with
Yeah.
government bureaucrats. I can tell you,
Yeah,
it
and
really, nothing warms me because this is why we're doing what we're doing.
yep, yep, and they're so appreciative. This
I
year's Hill
know.
Day was so great, and
Yeah, it
again,
was great.
we're gonna keep interviewing the Hill Day parents and then keep doing these special episodes and keep on going because we gotta keep
Definitely.
doing what we're doing. So thanks again so much,
Definitely.
and it's
Thank you,
a
Chrissy.
pleasure.
Appreciate it.